because right now we are wasting time with bullshit. We are not looking at what really is important because we're distracted by bullshit. We have to get the bullshit out of the way, and then we will have a much more productive, sophisticated dialogue about what's going on.
What exactly, what do you do? What do you do?
What I do for a living is corporate strategy. I have been doing this for a while now. I used to be in government-sponsored research. I used to work for CERN in Geneva, the big accelerator throughout the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. Then I went to corporate research, so privately funded research. Had a stint in the entrepreneurial world, founded a company, which is today part of Intel. And for the past several years, I've been doing corporate strategy in the high technology sector. So that's how I earn my living. But I have a completely different parallel life doing philosophy, which has been a passion of mine since very early, since I was almost a kid. Has evolved, become more serious, a serious aspect of my life over time. And today it's a pretty big thing in my life. It completely dominates my private life.
Yeah. So your main interest is the nature of consciousness, and it's your view of consciousness sort of goes against what most considered to be the nature of consciousness, which is that maybe you can explain what the current view of what consciousness is, or what that actually is, according to neuroscience.
Well, neuroscience, in principle, doesn't have a philosophical view. When we ask what is the essential nature, the categorical basis of something, in other words, what is it in and of itself, that's a philosophical question. It's a metaphysical question. About the nature of reality. Science busies itself with the behavior of reality, because that's all that can be discovered through experiment. An experiment basically means that you put a question to nature, and nature answers by behaving in a certain way, and then you can build models about nature's behavior, models that are practical, can be used for the development of technology, because we know if we do this, we get that. If we do that, we get that other thing. Nature behaves in this way, and it largely doesn't matter what nature is in and of itself to do science and to develop technology. But of course, our views regarding the nature of reality have an enormous bearing in terms of how we live our lives, what we consider to be important and not important, what is valuable and meaningful and what is not, what's going to happen after we die, can we expect anything to happen, what is the purpose of us being here, if there is any, how to live a rich, purposeful life. I mean, these are all very important questions, but they are not scientific questions. So I would say that neuroscience should be philosophically neutral, should be metaphysically neutral. But in reality, we are all human beings. We all have opinions and views about what reality essentially is. And I would say that still to this day, the mainstream view in neuroscience is that consciousness is what technically is called an epiphenomenon. In other words, consciousness is somehow generated generated by brain activity. And the reason we have to think that is that nature's behavior is so that there are very clear correlations between what we feel, what we experience, and patterns of brain activity. And you don't even need to go that far. If you put alcohol in your bloodstream and it goes up to your brain, it alters your experience. Of course, there are many other ways to explain this philosophically, but the cheapest, simplest way is to say, well, the brain generates experience, even though we have absolutely no clue of how that happens. So that's still the mainstream view.
Yeah. There's a sort of move to talking about the brain as if it's like a computer, and consciousness is some kind of software that's sort of running on the computer. And yeah, is that sort of how most people would see it?
I don't think so. I think people would see patterns of brain activity as software, neurons, as hardware, glial cells and neurons, and consciousness as the output of the software running on the hardware. So that would be the materialist view. But it's a view that has gigantic problems, including one that is arguably insurmountable, which is there is nothing about physical parameters like mass, charge, spin, momentum, space-time position, geometric relationships between particles. There is nothing about any of this in terms of which one could deduce the qualities of experience. It's a completely arbitrary bridge to say that, well, if I have that spin up and if I have that geometrical relationship and that charge, then I get red. Well, why red? Why is it not blue? Why is it not yellow? Why is it not a bellyache? The bridge is arbitrary from a logical point of view. All we have is the empirical correlations to go with. But of course, correlation does not imply causation, and you learned that first day at school, in philosophy school. But that is still the prevalent view, because I think people just don't have the imagination to conceive of much better alternatives, and that is surprising. That's maybe because we live within this ethos of materialism, of physicalism, already for so long, for the best part of 200 years, that it sort of has handicapped our imagination. we have become incapable to think of alternatives, but there are very good alternatives.
Yeah. I've been following your work quite a bit, and also have you heard of Donald Hoffman as well?
Oh, sure, I know Don. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you know him?
I've met him twice in person, I think, maybe 3 times.
Oh, wow, that's great. Oh, that's
three times actually. Yeah.
Okay. Well, because he's got some really interesting ideas as well, and it seems like more and more people are sort of becoming, I guess, a bit brave enough to sort of step up and move away from this idea that the world is, or the entirety of reality is just this mechanical, dead, insentient machine. If you think about it, it really doesn't make that sense, because that, like you point out endlessly, that isn't the way that our reality appears to us at all. Like it's entirely mental. Like if you think about it, it's very, very much like a dream. Like the way that we see reality, it's sort of like a very, very real dream. You were saying, why is that specific brain activity red and not this color, or not a bellyache or something? It's I think most of us don't question it because we just go along with our experiences. But yeah, at a certain point you sort of stop and you think, well, actually, what is this? And
it's not only that we don't question it. Even people who adopt materialism, well, technically it should be called mainstream physicalism. That would be the right thing to say, but we stick to materialism. Even materialists who don't look deeply into the implications of materialism, what it actually says, what it actually means, if they would look into those implications, they would think, oh my God, am I really a materialist then? Because what materialism basically says is that the world around you, as you perceive it, everything, the walls of your house, the trees down the road, the cars, the stars in the sky, all of that, as you perceive it, in other words, insofar as it is constituted by qualities, color, sound, smell, all of that is happening inside your skull. There is a real world out there, but it's not what you are seeing, it's not what you're smelling, it's not what you're touching. All of these things are qualities that are supposedly generated inside your skull by specific patterns of brain activity, and they are whatever they are for reasons that we don't understand, because in principle they could be anything else. So when you look up and you see the stars at night, those stars, as you see them, are inside your skull. So your real skull is beyond the stars. It's beyond the universe you see when you look up. The world is inside your head. The world you experience, your life as you experience it, is entirely inside your head. That's a materialist implication. What's really out there is entirely abstract. It has no qualities. it is only describable in terms of quantities. The best way to visualize it, you can't visualize it, because to visualize already entails qualities, and according to materialism, there are no qualities out there. But the best way to get close to it is to imagine it as a set of equations. So the world you think you see, according to materialism, is not the real world. It's a hallucination produced by your brain. Actually, there is a recent TED talk by a neuroscientist from the UK. What's his name? I'm drawing a blank. Anil Seth, yeah, in which he says just that, and he explains how your brain probably generates the hallucination you call reality. I think most people, if they really would internalize the actual implications of materialism, they would say, well, come on, that's absurd.
Yeah, and it gets a bit more confusing than that as well, isn't it? Well, like, more absurd, I guess, because not only are all the stars and everything in your skull, but your body is also within, in the mental activity in your skull. But also your skull is mental activity.
Correct.
In your skull as well.
The body the body as you see it when you look in the mirror or when you look down, the body as you see it is actually a representation inside your head generated by your brain. Your skull as you see it in the mirror is actually not your skull, it's a representation generated by your brain inside your head. You do have a real body out there, you do have a real skull out there, but they are completely inaccessible from consciousness. That's what materialism says. And what I say is, no, you know what? Things are just as they seem. Your body is really in your consciousness because all you know about it is that representation. Everything else is a theoretical abstraction that lacks empirical or theoretical substantiation, if you really follow the logic of it. And reality as you see it, the physical world as you see it, is really the way it is. There is nothing more to it than those experiences that you call the world around you and your body.
Yeah, and we can never escape experience as well, right? Like you were saying, in the physicalist position, all of that, that the whole universe as it appears to us, our bodies, our minds, our skulls, all of our perceptions are a mental activity within this machine that we are. And actually all of reality is entirely sort of abstract and, like a set of equations. But the thing is, you can never, how can an equation or mathematics exist without an experiencer of it to understand it? You get into these strange kind of thought games of trying to imagine how something could exist without something to experience it, and that's very you can't wrap your head around that one. Yeah.
You can't. You can only conceptually abstract it. So you have a concept that's pointing to something that you cannot imagine, but you just leave it at that. I mean, materialism is not gratuitous in the sense that there was a reason for it to be proposed, which is that we all seem to share the same world. The experiences I have of the world correlate with yours. If we were in the same public square, we would describe that public square in roughly the same way. So it is very compelling, this notion that there is a world out there within which we all are sharing that world. Or correlations of experience with brain activity, they are very compelling as well. The problem of materialism is this lack of creativity. People who adopt materialism think that there is no other way to make sense of these questions, to make sense of the fact that we seem to inhabit the same environment, to make sense of the fact that I can't change the world by a mere act of volition. Well, guess what? You can't even change your thoughts, your feelings by a mere act of volition. You can't control your dreams. But anyway, or that the experience correlates with brain activity. There are other ways to make sense of this without postulating this whole new ontological class of pure quantitative abstraction, completely separate and independent from experience, and out of which experience is somehow generated. Because the absurdity of this is that we start from experience. That's all we have. When we are born, we start from experience. All we have is experience. And then we conjure up this thing that is supposed to not be experience. And then we say, well, and my experience, which is what I start with, somehow arises from that. It's like a painter who paints a self-portrait and then points at it and says, I am that. Oh, now how do I explain my thoughts now? How do I come from ink pigments to my thoughts? That's the hard problem of consciousness. And it arises because of an absurd thought step. The idea that what is really real is not where you start from, it's an abstraction of your consciousness, and then trying to reduce your consciousness to that abstraction of consciousness. Well, guess what? That's never going to work. It's circular.
Yeah. Do you think that some of the resistance towards, some of the lack of openness towards new ideas about explaining reality, other than it being this non-mental objective realm, do you think there's a sort of fear of moving away from atheism? I mean, as someone who, I don't know what I would call myself now, but I would have called myself an atheist before. I was quite stridently so, and looking back now, I think, I was really stuck in the dogma that I was criticizing that in others, but I had my own dogma, and that was, science has explained the world, and the world is material, and it couldn't possibly be anything else, and there's consciousness is generated by the brain. And I actually had no idea that we hadn't explained it. I just assumed that we had. So, I was quite shocked when I was listening to Sam Harris one day on one of his podcasts, and he was saying, we actually have no idea what consciousness is, and I was like, oh my god.
Yeah. Well, I started from there as well. I mean, in my early life, I just took it for granted that that's how things were, because the environment where I went to university very early. I had just turned 17. That was my world, that was my environment. I think one thing that is important is to decouple this from the idea of God or atheism. I mean, it may have a lot of relation to this, but because we don't know what each person understands by the word God, coupling these two things is dangerous. An idealist like me is not necessarily a person who believes in the God of the Old Testament, an anthropomorphic being who is passionate about what his chosen people does. That's not necessarily the case. Having said that, your question was, well, how have we come to this? Why there is so much resistance to any alternative? I think at any point in time, the mainstream metaphysics of a culture is not determined by rational, logical arguments. It's determined by psychosocial dynamics. It's basically psychology at the scale of a culture, of a civilization, of a society. And these psychosocial dynamics, they change over time. In other words, people's references, tastes, fashions, or to be more specific, people's sense of plausibility, that changes over time. What is plausible at one point in time, 50 years later, may be completely implausible. I mean, what we consider plausible today around quantum mechanics would have been completely implausible just 50 years earlier, in the time of Lord Kelvin, in the mid-19th century, or maybe even earlier than Lord Kelvin. So the mainstream is not determined by good argument. It's determined by the sensitivities of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, the psychology of the society. In the case of materialism, I think one psychological dynamics has been, earlier disappointments that people had with this idea of human beings, man, as they said at the time, being the center of the universe, everything going around us. Once we realized that this sort of Copernican view was not quite correct, and we felt that, okay, we cannot be disappointed again, so we're going to swing the pendulum to the entire other side and say we are completely insignificant. We are phantasms. Actually, we don't even really exist, because consciousness is just this ephemeral epiphenomenon of brain activity that just comes and goes in no time, like a mayfly. So there is a lot of psychological momentum behind that. And another thing that plays in the hands of materialism, although it's just false, is this idea that somehow materialism is connected or is an enabler of the success of technology. And that's complete nonsense. Science can be done without any metaphysical view. You don't care what nature really is, you only care how it behaves. If you know how it behaves, you can build the models that you need in order to develop technology. We would be exactly where we are today in terms of technology advancement, arguably even beyond, if we were all idealists since the 19th century. But somehow in the popular psyche, not only in the popular psyche, even in the psyches of many scientists who are now the spokespeople of science today, arguably they are not real scientists, but anyway, they are the spokespeople of science. Even for them, there is this link, this unexamined link, that when you look really into it, you don't need to look very deep. You just spend 15 minutes really thinking about this, and you realize that it's complete nonsense. But materialism hijacks the plausible aspects of other things, like in order to promote itself. Like, well, materialism hijacks the success of technology by coupling itself to it when this coupling is not there, it's invented. Or it hijacks the plausibility of idealism, which says that the world, the physical world, is actually what it seems to be. It's made of qualities, it's made of things that you can touch, it's made of concreteness, palpability, colors, things that you smell, touch, taste. That's from idealism, but somehow, although materialism says exactly the opposite, people associate the plausibility of idealism with materialism. And they even go further, and they say that, well, I am not an idealist because I don't believe that the world is in my head. Well, guess what? It's materialism that says that.
Yes.
And it's idealism that says that it's your head that is in the world, not the world in your head. So this is not about rational discussions. This is about misconceptions. This is about psychology. It's an entirely different dynamics. Yeah.
I've noticed that in conversations with people about this kind of idea, well, people's thinking is so rigidly confined by this view of materialism, specifically like consciousness can only exist inside a brain because that's the thing that generates it. So if you say, well, consciousness is the only thing that there is, people are sort of confused by that, because it's like, well, how could that be the case? Because if I look at that thing over there and then I walk out of the room and I come back, it's still there.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
It's all, So how would you counter that kind of argument? Because I mean, it's a pretty simple one to counter, but the next claim might sound a bit outlandish to someone who says that. Yeah.
Look, when an idealist says that everything is in mind or everything is in consciousness, he or she is not saying that everything is in your mind and everything is in your consciousness. The appeal to consciousness and mind is an appeal to an ontological category, not a particular instance or configuration of that category. The world is not in my mind alone. The world is in mind, but what I identify with as my mind is a tiny subset of mind. That would be the idealist response. So what an idealist is basically saying is, there is indeed something out there beyond your personal mind, beyond your personal consciousness. There is this something out there independent of living beings, which holds its own state even when you're not looking at it. So when I park my car in my garage and come up and sleep at night and I go back in the morning and, hey, guess what? My car is still in my garage. Even though nobody was looking at it, that only means that there is a mind beyond me, a transpersonal mind, within which the car exists as a mental phenomenon. That transpersonal mind holds its own state, regardless of whether I'm interacting with it or not. And what the car is the extrinsic appearance of that mental process as I interact with it, as I look at it. In other words, it's the way mind at large presents one of its processes to me as a dissociated part of mind that is interacting with the rest of mind. Now, you may say, well, that's very analogous to materialism. Indeed it is. There is something out there that holds the state of the world, that is still there even if I'm not looking at it. Why is it more plausible then? Well, there's a very big difference. Materialism says this thing that is out there is non-mind. It is not mental. And mind is something that is generated by configurations of this non-mental thing. Well, then you create an abyss. You create this gaping abyss between non-mind and mind. How do you bridge that? Well, guess what? That's the hard problem of consciousness. What an idealist would say is, what is out there is a mental process. What is in here is a mental process. When they interact, boom, the physical world appears as contents of perception, which are also mental. So all I need to say is, mental processes of different qualities, when they interact, they induce or they modulate another mental process with other qualities. Now, that mental processes of different qualities can modulate one another, even generate one another, is trivial. I can modulate my emotions just by thinking. If I have a good thought, I feel good. If I have a bad thought, I feel afraid or I feel anxious. And my emotions modulate my thoughts as well. If I'm feeling anxious, well, I have a whole different thought life than otherwise. So that different mental processes can interact and modulate each other, generating different kinds of qualities, is trivial. And that's all the idealist needs. There are mental processes out there. When they interact with my own mental processes, perception arises as a sort of interference pattern between the two. There is no hard problem. There is no fundamental gap.
Yeah. So, okay, what you're saying there is right. So we are a set of mental processes, and we are embedded in a larger set of mental processes, which is the universe, or what we see of as the universe, what we experience as the universe. So I thought of this this sort of analogy earlier. I don't know whether this is a good one. Wanted to test it out with you. So if you're in a dream, right, you don't really know why you're there. You're just suddenly in a dream, and oftentimes you don't are aware that you're in a dream. So you have this sort of limited consciousness where you're just experiencing the dream environment and going with events as they happen. And it's a very limited consciousness, but you're a set of mental processes in a dream. But you're a set of mental processes in a dream, but that you're in your own mind, right?
Yeah.
So you're this limited consciousness in a dream world. But that dream world is your mind. It's the contents of your So it's like it's a bit like that's what reality is, but one step up. So we're in this sort of hyperreal dream, and we don't really know it. And we're in a set of mental processes in like a mind that's greater than this set of mental processes.
Yes. Yes.
Would you say that's a good way of thinking about it?
It's a fairly good analogy. Yeah. The difference is that usually in a regular dream, you're the only real character in the dream, and the other characters are just projections of your own mind. In other words, there is nothing it is like to be the other characters in the dream. They only exist insofar as what you experience. In other words, there is only a facade, there is only a face, there is no inner life. At least that's a reasonable assumption to make for most dreams. And while in this world, you have an inner life. You don't exist only as far as what I'm seeing right now. You're not a projection of my personal mind. There is something behind that. You have thoughts, feelings that I cannot access. There is something it is like to be you. So that's where the analogy has to be extended a bit. But in general, it is a psychological process that tells us what we are and what we are not, whether we identify with something or not. When you're in a dream, although the dream scenario is being generated by your mind, you don't identify with it. You lose volitional control over it, and you don't think that those dynamisms are your own. You think that's external. That's merely a process of identification, because in principle the entire scenery of a dream could be reproduced by directed imagination while you are awake. You can replay the entire dream in your mind under the control of your volition, and everything would be the same, except that in the second case, you are aware that those processes are being created by yourself. But guess what? There are psychological phenomena that, for instance, some people, they suffer an accident and they hit their head, and they don't lose their memories. They still have their memories, but they become dissociated from their memories in terms of ownership. In other words, they have their memories, but it feels to them that like those are the memories of someone else.
Wow.
That was somebody else's life. Yeah, they can remember everything, but they're like, but that was not me. This exists. So we know that mind is perfectly capable of having these dynamics of identifying and disidentifying with things, associating and disassociating. We know that people can undergo conditions, today they are called dissociative identity disorder. They used to be called multiple personality disorder, in which your conscious inner life sort of breaks up into multiple separate but parallel centers of consciousness, and they even vie for control of the body. For a long time, skeptics were saying, well, this is not true, people are inventing it and making this up. But now with the latest neuroimaging techniques, we've known for at least the past 5-6 years that this is really true, that when you put people with dissociative identity disorder under a brain scanner and you compare that to the brain scans of actors pretending to have dissociative identity disorder, things look different. There has been research in Germany 4 years ago in which a woman had these multiple alters, these dissociated personalities, and one of the alters claimed to be blind and another one could see. And they hooked this woman up to an EEG, and guess what? When the blind alter was in control, there was no brain activity in the visual cortex, even though her eyes were wide open. I mean, that's something you cannot fake. And when a sighted alter would reassume control, then poof, the brain activity would return. We also know that patients with dissociative identity disorder, when they dream, the dream is experienced, the same dream is experienced by the different alters from different points of view. Different alters are different characters in the dream. So in that case, there is really something it is like to be a character in your dream. It may be another alter of your mind. So what all of this points to is that there is only one mind within this whole game of life happens, the whole universe, and we are dissociated alters within this big dream. This is the most plausible, strictly speaking, the most plausible interpretation of reality from a metaphysical perspective. Miles more plausible than the fairy tale of materialism.
Okay, so the dissociation. So could you talk about a bit of the dynamics about how this dissociation would work? Because in a human mind, you might imagine how different neurological circuits could be, like with the left and right hemisphere thing. You know, when they did the experiment with the split brain patients, and the two hemispheres were severed, and there was like a physiological barrier between them, and so they acted as if there were two centers of consciousness, or they actually were two centers of consciousness then. So what would be the dynamics of dissociation at a level of like universal consciousness, where there's entities such as human beings that feel completely separate from one another?
It's very difficult to think about this not making materialist assumptions in the background without even knowing. So even the way you stated your question sort of suggests that mind is somehow generated by configurations of neurons. So if you cut them, mind splits. To some extent, this is true, because what I propose is the following. Our brains, including its ordinary patterns of activity, this is what the mental activity within a dissociated alter looks like. That's why there is a correlation between the two. The image of the process correlates with the inner dynamics of the process. Of course, one is the image of another. Of course, they will correlate. But the image does not cause the process. Your brain activity does not cause your dissociated inner life. It is what your dissociated inner life looks like from across the dissociative boundary. And then if I go and sever your corpus callosum as a neurosurgeon, well, the severing of your corpus callosum is the image of an interaction between mental processes. The severing is not causing anything. The severing is the image of a mental process interfering with another. And of course, mental processes can interfere with one another. Your listening to loud music will interfere with your concentration. And the listening to the loud music is a mental process. Your concentration is a mental process. They interfere with one another. So things happen as if the anatomy and patterns of activity, patterns of metabolism in your brain did generate experience, because I can go in and sever it in two, and guess what? Something changes in inner experience. But even that severing itself is the image of a mental process. Now, having made this disclaimer, how does dissociation happen? Why does it happen? I don't know. I mean, we don't know why the universe started, how it started. We don't even know if asking these questions make any sense. There may be no why. There may be no when, because if time started when the universe started, there is no point in asking how it started, because there was no time before that. So we don't even know whether these questions make sense. There are many questions we cannot answer, whether you are operating under materialist assumptions or idealist assumptions. All I could say is what we call life, organic life, metabolizing life. That's the image of dissociative processes in universal consciousness. That's how I look at that. How did the dissociation start? I don't know, for exactly the same reason that I don't know how life started. Because you see, I'm talking about the same thing. Life is the appearance. It's the extrinsic appearance, the image of these dissociative processes. If we figure out how abiogenesis happened, how life arose from non-life, we would be closer to answering the question of how did this universal dissociation begin. All we have to go with are the images. Other than that, you have to be the thing you're trying to study. For as long as I am not the universe itself, all I have is how the universe presents itself to me. And guess what? We call that matter. Matter is the extrinsic appearance of the mental workings of the universe. Maybe when I die, which means the image, which means dissociation ending. If life is the image of dissociation, then death is the image of the end of dissociation. Maybe then I will be the universe again, or maybe I will be some higher level in the hierarchy of the dissociation. I will know a little bit more, although I may not be able to self-reflect. But for as long as we are alive, all we have to go with are the images.
You just mentioned something I was going to ask about next, which is within the dissociative alters in the universal consciousness, would there be, like you said, a hierarchy? So are things that we experience in our reality, such as the Earth, an image of a dissociative process in the mental activity of the universe? Might it be like something to be, might it feel like something to be the Earth, or be the biosphere, or be a galaxy, for example, in the view of idealism? Maybe.
I don't see directly compelling reasons to infer that that's the case. I'm open to it potentially being the case. I think what unifies all life is what we call metabolism. DNA, protein folding, protein copying, mitosis. These are the things that not only distinguish metabolism from everything else in the universe, but also unifies all life as something related. It unifies all the variety of the forms of life into one clearly defined category, and that is metabolism. So I think we have very good reasons to think of metabolism as images of the dissociation. Does the planet Earth metabolize? Well, strictly speaking, not. There is no DNA, there is no protein folding. Could you imagine that other organic processes at a higher level may also be the image of some higher level form of dissociation in a hierarchy of dissociation? That is conceivable. The question is, do we have enough reason to think that, to postulate that? I personally am open to the idea, but I do not defend it, because I don't think I have enough to pursue it. I mean, the Gaia hypothesis has been around for a while. Some of it is intriguing, some of it is compelling even. I think that opens the door for this kind of thinking at a planetary level. Maybe we are cells in a bigger organism, the same way that my skin cells are a part of my organism, and I don't sit crying when I shed some skin cells in the course of my day. Maybe, but I think that's a much more difficult question to answer with a yes than to say metabolizing life as we know it clearly is the image of dissociation. And I know that because I cannot read your thoughts. I cannot know what the universe is thinking. Therefore, my inner life is obviously dissociated, and I am a metabolizing organism. So I'm ready to extrapolate that to other metabolizing organisms, but I'm not ready to go beyond.
Okay. What is non-biological matter then, if it is not an image of a form of consciousness?
It certainly is, but it's not an image of a locally dissociated alter of consciousness.
Oh, I see. Okay,
so
okay, yeah.
I do think there is something it is like to be the inanimate universe. The inanimate universe has conscious inner life, because matter is the extrinsic appearance of conscious inner life. Certainly in my case, so unless I postulate an arbitrary discontinuity in nature, all matter should be the appearance of conscious inner life. But then the question is my mobile phone a dissociated alter? Is there something it is like to be my mobile phone in and of itself, apart from the rest? I don't think so, for the same reason that there is nothing it's like to be a single neuron in your head. There is only something it is like to be your entire nervous system as a whole. A single neuron is just a part of that image. I think all inanimate matter in the universe is just parts of the image of universal inner life. There's nothing it's like to be my mobile phone, but there is something it is like to be the inanimate universe as a whole. And guess what? When we look at the structure of the universe at the largest scales, it looks exquisitely organic. It looks like the patterns of network connections is uncannily similar, mathematically speaking, to the pattern of neurons, how neurons connect in your head. That's how galaxies and galaxy clusters seem to connect and cluster with dark matter in between them. They cluster in a way that is very similar, mathematically speaking, to an organic nervous system network. And that may not be by mere chance.
Yeah, it's a curious little coincidence, that, isn't it? I've seen those pictures of neurons and a picture of like a simulation of the universe at the largest scale together. And it's very hard to tell.
You shouldn't go with pictures. And here I will adopt a skeptical position. You can make any two things look like one another. If you crop it the right way, you turn it the right way, you use the right saturation, change a different color scheme, you can make anything look like something else. I think what really weighs in here is two studies, one in Italy, the latest one, and another one from California, 2012, I believe. One is 2017, the other one is 2012. They did a mathematical analysis, and that you can rely on because that's pretty objective. It's not about how it looks. You can get quantified relationships between these two domains in terms of their respective network structure, and that I think is compelling. Although the pretty pictures are indeed exquisite. Yeah.
Right. There was something I was going to ask. Okay, so you used the term mind at large earlier, and that reminded me about, well, Aldous Huxley uses that word, doesn't he? And I think he got that from someone else. But anyway, he wrote that book, Doors of Perception, and he talks about the brain as a reducing valve of the consciousness of the mind at large. Do you think that's one of the functions of whatever the brain is an image of? So the brain is an image of a process of consciousness, a dissociative process of consciousness, and maybe part of the function of that dissociative process is to inhibit certain things, like and not take everything in. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think things work as though the brain were a reducing valve of consciousness. As a metaphor, I think it's valid. It conveys the right intuition about what's happening. Even if you explore the implications of it, they all come out right. If you destroy the brain, then mind is not filtered anymore. It expands. The problem is that when you get into more strictly defined philosophy, you have to have conceptual clarity, you have to be conceptually consistent. If you're a monist, like I am, I think there's only mind as substance, as even substance is an analogy. The only categorical basis in the universe is mental, is experiential. Then the reducing valve metaphor is complicating, because when you think, what images does the metaphor appeal to? You see a pipe, you see a valve, and you see water flowing through the pipe, and then when you close the valve, water trickles. That's dualistic. You're talking about water and something that is not water that can work as a reducing valve to the flow of water. So there is consciousness, and there's something that's not consciousness, which sort of reduces the flow of consciousness. That's dualistic. I think what's really happening is that, strictly speaking, the brain is not a reducing valve. The brain is the image of a dissociative process. But because it is a dissociative process, that dissociated piece of mind, so to say, can only experience its own dissociated contents. It loses access to the rest because it loses the cognitive associations that could bridge its inner life to the inner life of the world around it. So everything works as though it were a reducing valve. But as a monist, I need to be consistent.
Yeah. So we don't take in overwhelming amounts of mental information from the world around us, because we're literally just dissociated from it.
Yeah. Once you're dissociated, there is a dissociative boundary, and no access you have to what is beyond you is not first-person experience access anymore. It's only second and third person, because the mental activity in the world around you impinges on the dissociative boundary of your being. And that is, of course, your skin, your eyes, your sense organs. That's the image of the dissociative boundary. And through that impingement, you gain a second or third person perspective to what's going on. That's what we call perception.
So do you think that these experiences of transcendence and oneness and things that people report, kind of meditation or psychedelics, do you think these are like sort of mental route to that, to the consciousness beyond our dissociation?
Yeah. Look, if I'm correct, then the brain and its ordinary activity are the image of a well-working dissociative process. So if ordinary brain activity is impaired, either because you've taken psychedelics which reduce brain activity, all of them that have been studied have been shown to only reduce brain activity, or if you meditate, which also reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, then what does that mean? The image is brain activity is being impaired or reduced. That's the image. What is it an image of? Well, if ordinary brain activity is the image of dissociation, reduced brain activity is the image of reduced dissociation. Guess what? It's no surprise then that people have this experience of expanded mind when brain activity is impaired. And it's not only meditation and psychedelics. The pattern is much broader. There have been studies, a study in Italy, 2010, they studied brain cancer patients before and after surgery. Surgery always leads to some collateral damage in the brain. And the experience of self-transcendence is much higher after surgery. Significantly higher, that should be the word, significantly, because it has a clear statistical meaning. Studies of Vietnam War veterans that had damage, brain damage, anatomical damage, much more prone to experiences of self-transcendence as well, but significantly more prone to experiences of self-transcendence. Breathing techniques like hyperventilation can lead to experiences of self-transcendence, even hallucinations.
Why is that? Does that reduce brain activity, hyperventilation?
If you hyperoxygenate your blood alkalinity levels increase. That can damage the brain if the alkalinity is too high. So there is vasoconstriction in your brain. Yeah, the tiny blood vessels in your brain get constricted in order to safeguard the brain from damage. Well, when that happens, activity goes down. There's less blood around to feed metabolism. There's less oxygen, less sugars. Your brain activity goes down. You hallucinate. It's so consistent, this pattern. The choking game that teenagers worldwide unfortunately play. It's a very dangerous game in which you partly strangulate yourself, you partly choke yourself.
Gotcha.
And it leads to experiences of euphoria, self-transcendence, hallucinations. It's a very consistent pattern. I published, I think it was 2 years ago, I published a short essay on Scientific American, basically listing all of these things. And it's a consistent correlation between activities that impair brain activity. Not all of them, because some activities, some brain impairment just screws up with the alter. It doesn't impact the dissociation, but screws up the contents of the alter. But the fact that there are so many consistent instances in which impaired brain activity seems to impact the dissociation and lead to an expansion of awareness is very significant. It cannot be made sense of by materialism.
Are you aware of the studies with DMT at Imperial College London?
Yeah,
you heard about those?
Yeah. It was. They started with psilocybin and then LSD. I'm not sure they did DMT in Imperial, but yes, I'm familiar.
They did. There was a guy, Chris Timmerman. Well, I think he was Imperial College. Yeah, he was Imperial College London. Chris Timmerman. So, just as we're on the subject of like decreased brain activity and things like that, and there was this study where it was one of the first brain imaging studies using DMT. So they took EEG recordings of the brain activity, gave people DMT, and alpha brainwave frequencies in the visual areas of the brain just completely dropped off, and then gradually came back in. And I thought that was really interesting when I was watching. I think it was a Breaking Convention. I was watching a video online, seeing his presentation. I thought that was pretty interesting how that particular brainwave, that particular brain activity just drops, and then people experience this, blasting out of their body into some transcendental realm of consciousness and meeting entities that communicate with them, and then 10 minutes later they're back.
Yeah.
When the brain activity comes back in. So I did a little bit of research. What do alpha brainwaves do specifically? And I found this paper that shows that they have an inhibitory mechanism in the brain for inhibiting distracting stimuli that are not relevant to the task at hand. Now, I find it really, really funny that not funny, but incredibly interesting that this brain activity that inhibits distracting stimuli, if it completely cuts off, you then experience
the rest floods in. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So that brings all kinds of questions, because we can just say, oh, it's all hallucination, but that's quite arrogant, really, in my view. Indigenous communities who have used DMT for, well, it seems millennia. There was some evidence that I think it's about at least 2,000 years or something like that. In their view, it's a spiritual realm that they're going to. And I don't know, it seems like it could be a possibility that that's what it is.
Well, I think it is. I also think we have to be careful in how we interpret this whole thing. So I'll play the devil's advocate.
Okay.
The brain operates in many bands. Alpha, beta, theta, gamma. There are many bands of brain activity. The fact that alpha has reduced does not necessarily mean that the other bands also reduced. For all you know, the other bands may have increased. So it could be that during a psychedelic trance, based on this one study alone, it would still be conceivable that although alpha reduces, there is an increase in brain activity in other bands that could account for the hallucinations, that could account for the visions. It wouldn't defeat materialism in and of itself. To defeat materialism, we have to look at least 4 bands. Gamma, it's questionable. It has to do with muscular activity. There is some discussion whether gamma waves could explain psychedelic experiences, and the reason is they are very difficult to measure. There are lots of artifacts related to gamma waves, so the results are not reliable. That's why I think the most impressive results are not the ones done with MAG or EEG, but the ones done with bold or ASL signals, which are basically correlates of direct correlates of metabolism, blood oxygenation level, because that covers all bands. You know, if your brain has less fuel, that will impact all bands. Doesn't matter how fast you're oscillating, it will impact all bands because there is just less fuel. And there are results also from Imperial, different drugs tested, bold and ASL signals, showing that brain activity only reduces. There is no increase in brain activity anywhere. That was the original 2012 study. Came out, I think, in January 2012. And the study that kicked off all these series of studies done at Imperial. There were studies done before. There were and even later there have been some neuroimaging studies done, I think, in Brazil with ayahuasca. There have been some phenomenological studies done at Johns Hopkins much earlier than the Imperial studies. There have been studies done even recently at University of Zurich, I think. Also neuroimaging, also showing only reduction in brain activity, which is interesting because it was in Zurich that the original result was achieved, showing that LSD or not a psychedelic, I don't remember, could increase brain activity. But that had to do with a metabolic rebound because the study was not very granular in time. They didn't know well, it's technical stuff. That stuff was wrong and they redone it and now they did it better. And again, brain activity only reduces. I think this result came out last year from Zurich. Yeah.
There was a psilocybin study, it wasn't there, that I think you got into a bit of an argument with, who was it? Who headed that study?
Yeah. He's the current head of the psychedelic group at Imperial, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, what was the disagreement there? So, if I'm right, was he saying that the psilocybin was increasing brain activity, and you were saying no? If you look at maybe you could explain.
Okay. There was a study by that group done in 2014. Mm-hmm. The main author was Enzo Tagliazucci, I think is his name. He has a digital signal processing background, and they looked at brain activity variability in the psychedelic state. So that was not a direct measurement of brain metabolism, it was a measurement of variability. In other words, you take the average signal out and you only look at how it varies. It's like you're looking at acceleration, not speed. That would be the analogy to make. Okay. So they concluded that brain activity variability increased in dream-related areas during the psychedelic state. In other words, processes were kicking in and out, starting and stopping. There was more variability. But the entire DSP analysis starts by removing the mean signal. In other words, removing the average level of brain activity and only looking at the variations. So you can no longer compare that with the placebo state, because that comparison should be a comparison between the two averages, or at least between the two entire signals. And then you can know, did it decrease or did it increase compared to placebo or compared to no psychedelics? So that analysis would tell you nothing about whether brain activity, both signal level, ASL signal level, metabolism, increased or decreased. It only looks at the variability. But Carhart Harris gave a number of interviews and even wrote an article for that website, The Conversation, in which he claims outright that brain activity increased. And he said that multiple times. The quotes are still there. He never corrected that. He never changed it. We had, I contacted him personally, explaining why I thought that was wrong. He brought in Enzo in that private discussion. Enzo confirmed what I was saying. Then I asked him, can you correct it then? And the discussion died. That happened in 2014. They asked me to not disclose that conversation, which I honored, until I was accused last year by Enzo, and I don't think it was malicious, he just misremembered it. He accused me publicly on Twitter, saying that I had misunderstood that and that he corrected me. And I thought, hey, it was precisely the other way around. I corrected you guys and you, Enzo, confirmed what I was saying. And then I published that entire conversation from 2014. And look, I think that group is doing extremely important work. I think psychedelics for as an alternative to psychiatric medicines is something that should be looked at. I think there's a lot of promise. I think they're doing very good work in that direction. But I do regret that the communication was, in my opinion, highly mismanaged. And I think that can happen. You may become confused with an area of expertise like digital signal processing that's not your area, and you're a co-author of that paper, but you didn't do that part, and you got confused and you misspoke in interviews and even in your write-up. But once that's pointed out to you, I think it's a question of integrity and honesty to go back and repair that. And that has not happened to this day. I looked at it, I happened to have looked at it just this morning, and the conversation piece is still unchanged. Claims of brain activity increasing, and the media frenzy about it never stopped. There was a study in 2016 about LSD in which the media took images of increased functional coupling between certain brain areas and claimed, oh, this is increased brain activity. I mean, the whole study was massively misrepresented in the media. Now, I don't know whether the researchers themselves are responsible for that miscommunication, so I'm not going to say that they were. But if I were a researcher and my study were so drastically misrepresented in the media to the point that the opposite is said, the opposite of what was actually found, I would be writing pieces online and calling the journalists and correcting it. I think it's a matter of integrity, of honesty. And in my opinion, there is a problem in this respect regarding what's being communicated by Robin to the world, or what's not being communicated and should be. I take exception with that. It's just my opinion. I'm not in any ethics board. I don't want to be. I'm not in academia. I earn my living with corporate strategy. The people who pay me don't care what my positions are. I think people in academia live in a different reality in this regard. They have to pay attention, you know, they have to play the game well. But at some point you come to the boundary of just sheer honesty or dishonesty. And I think that should be looked at.
Well, I wonder why he never corrected himself. Do you think there's a narrative that people want to stick to? Do you think, like I was saying earlier about the you know, I know what it was like to be stuck in that very dogmatic atheist view of seeing the world, and not willing to accept any other possibility. Do you think some of that is sort of entrenched in the scientific community? So that there's a sort of narrative that they feel they have to kind of stick to. Do you think that's the case with some people?
It's difficult.
I'm not saying him specifically, but
I know you're making a general question, but given what we just talked about, whatever answer I give you now can be misconstrued and misinterpreted. Yeah. So I'm just going to say this: I think every scientist is just a human being, and human beings are not perfect. They don't operate on a purely rational basis. They are not unbiased. They have had education. They live in a social milieu. They have professional pressures. They have a certain self-image. There are egos. They have different maturity levels. All of this plays in that psychic mix that orients and influences the actions people take or fail to take. I don't think scientists are invulnerable to that at all. They are not, as Nietzsche said, they are not objectifying frogs with cold entrails. You know, that's not how it works.
Right. Trying to think of. Oh, right. I have one question. How long have you got, by the way?
I don't have it. I finished my work for today. So.
Oh, okay. Well, my friend Phil follows your stuff as well, and he had a question that he wanted to ask. Let me just find it. It's quite an interesting one. So I think we might have already touched upon it, actually. But, right. He says that we seem very conservative in our use of the word consciousness, even while not seeming to have a complete definition. There is a lot of research showing the response and communication pathways between and within plants. Do you think that we may start to be more liberal with the term conscious as we understand more about as we understand more and more about primitive life, could this have implications for our moral dilemmas, such as how we value a life? That's quite a good one.
I think this is an excellent question, and it puts the finger on a key issue, which is when different people use the word consciousness, they often mean completely different things. There is a particular one that is so prevalent that I think is worth mentioning. Some people mean by consciousness what philosophers call pure phenomenal consciousness. A being is conscious if there is something it is like to be that being. In other words, if there is something it feels like to be in that state, then that state is phenomenally conscious. It does not require metacognition, higher level mental functions, not even cognition as it's defined. It's just whether there are experiential qualities. So all that is required for you to say there is consciousness in that sense is if there are experiential qualities experienced from a first-person perspective. Another definition of consciousness that is very popular, very much used in psychology to this day, is what should be, in fact, be called meta-consciousness. When you have pain, then you are conscious, because there are the qualities of pain that you are experiencing. There is something it is like to feel the pain. Then you are phenomenally conscious. But for you to be able to report and say, I have pain, to report that to another, or even to yourself, to tell yourself, I have pain, something else is needed. Beyond the raw experience of pain, you have to know that you have the experience of pain. This knowing that you have an experience is a re-representation. It is a metacognitive process in which mind turns in onto itself and investigates, analyzes, and characterizes its own experiences. And then you have a meta-experience that says, I have pain. For many people, if you cannot report, I have pain, then I am unconscious. And guess what? That would make every animal in the world, with possible exceptions of higher primates and cetaceans, unconscious. Because they don't report, perhaps not even to themselves, what they experience. My cat's not going around saying, oh, I'm experiencing a fly, I'm experiencing my food. No, we do that. We do that. We do that so much. We are such highly metacognitive animals. We do that so much that when we don't do that, we think we don't have the experience. For instance, you always experience your breathing. The air flowing through your nostrils, your rib cage inflating, deflating, your diaphragm moving. But only if I tell you, do you experience your breathing? Then you say, oh, now I'm experiencing my breathing. Because now you are metacognitively aware that you are experiencing your breathing. 1 minute ago, you were experiencing your breathing too. Do you remember that? You don't. It's as if you were not breathing. It's as if you were completely unconscious of breathing. So we are so into this metacognition that people confuse metaconsciousness with consciousness. I think plants are conscious. Plants are metabolizing organisms. Therefore, in my view, they are the extrinsic appearance, the image of a dissociated alter of universal consciousness. And there is something it is like to be a plant. It's a metabolizing organisms, so they have consciousness, phenomenal consciousness. Do they have meta-consciousness? Certainly not. They don't have the nervous system to allow that to happen. You need mental processes that sort of form loops. Giulio Tononi calls that, when you have sufficient loops, he calls that the phi. You cross the phi threshold, which is this information integration theory of consciousness, which I disagree with because I don't think that these loops of information integration generate consciousness. I think they are the image of meta-consciousness, when mind turns in on itself to evaluate its own contents of experience and then be able to report it to another and to itself. And since Giulio depends on the reports of subjects, the reports of volunteers, the volunteers only report metacognition. Therefore, he associates consciousness with these closed loops of information integration, which are actually closed loops of metacognition. You may have raw experience without that, in my view. So I think plants, all animals, all metabolizing organisms, even the amoeba in my toilet, they are conscious, but not meta-conscious.
Right. Okay. It's sort of like there's like awareness. So the kind of awareness that you might have in a dream, for example. You're not really aware that you're aware. You're just aware. But then when we're awake, we're aware that we're aware. And then maybe there's levels where you're aware that you're aware that you're aware.
You're right on. Research.
And it could just go on infinitely.
Yes, maybe. You're right on. There's research to substantiate what you just said. During the dream state, you largely lose the ability to metacognize. While you are in the dream, you're not asking, what am I doing here? What is this about? No, you just flow with the experience of the dream, like a leaf in the wind. After you wake up, then you recall the dream, and then you're metacognitively aware of the dream in recall. And then you start asking yourself, what did that mean? But in the dream, you don't ask that question. You lack metacognition in the dream. So I think if we can introspect into what it is like to have a dream, not to remember the dream, what it is like to have a dream, we will get close to what it is like to be a dog, what it is like to be a cat. This idea that you just experience without metacognitive inquiries, like who am I, what am I doing here? And it is this metacognition that creates human suffering. We are thinking about the future, we are regretting about the past, panicking about the future, what might happen. These are all metacognitive loops that take us from the here and now.
I think that's one, if you say something like, oh, maybe plants are conscious, a lot of people look at you like, here we go, what a load of woo-woo nonsense, because what they think you're talking about is the plant is sat there thinking about the weather and what a nice day is today and all this kind of thing. But like you can, that's a particular type of consciousness that we're familiar with.
Exactly.
Memory and imagination, you were just saying about thinking about the future and things. Memory and imagination are quite characteristic of our kind of consciousness, aren't they? Like one thing that happens often with me is, so I live on the 5th floor of an apartment block, and I'm going up and down the stairs all the time, walking the dogs and doing this and doing that, going to work. I'll often come in on the 1st floor, and I'll just be, and then I'm on the 5th floor, and I'm like, well, wait, how did I get here? Yeah. Like I can't remember, but if I pay attention, it takes forever, and it's a right nightmare, trudging up the 5 floors in the heat. But yeah, it's so. But when I look back on it, I can't really remember doing it, but I know that I was aware at the time. I didn't go up the stairs in a blind unconsciousness like a lump of meat, just going up the stairs. I know that I was aware. So you can have awareness without this sort of self-reflective. And I think, so maybe memory has a real role in our particular consciousness.
I think memory is highly connected to self-reflection. You only remember that which you were self-reflectively aware of. You have to tell yourself a story about what you're experiencing, and then what you remember is the story, which then through a trivial cognitive association recovers the actual memory of the experience. But the key is the story you tell yourself. If you're not telling yourself a story about what am I experiencing right now, you don't remember things. And you can see that through these mnemonic techniques that people use to remember things. These are all things that trigger this metacognition. You have to tell yourself a story about what you're experiencing, otherwise you don't remember it. I don't think animals tell themselves a story. The experience you have going up the stairs, I have driving. There was a time in my life I would drive all the time between the Netherlands where I live and Germany. Hours on the road. And sometimes I would arrive in Cologne, in Germany, and how did I get here? I'm not remembering at all, but presumably I was aware. I was not metacognitively aware, but I was aware. I think if you want to know what it feels like to be a sunflower turning towards the sun, I would say, well, it's something like what it felt like for you to breathe 30 seconds ago, which you don't remember. But you were aware of it. I mean, there is even studies that associate metacognition with semiotic operations, and it's a technical term, but it means that you become meta-conscious of something when you name it, when you put a label on it. You may be feeling hungry, but until you put a label on it and you say, I am hungry, you are not metacognitively aware of it. It is this naming, this moment of self-reflection, as it's written technically in the papers, that is associated not only with memory formation, but with the ability to report on an experience. So we are more or less unique animals. We have this ability to self-reflectively introspect through a semiotic operation, through labeling, through attaching a symbol to an experience, and then creating a chain that works as a key to memory. With that chain, with that key, you can open the gates of memory and remember. But if you don't do that, yeah, life passes you by. You only live in the moment, but you can't recover it later.
That labeling obsession that we have with slapping a label on everything, and that's, I think it shapes our thinking as well. You know, we don't feel, the idea that there's this inherent oneness of everything is sort of counterintuitive to a lot of people, because just the way that we think about and talk about the world, you know, you're a human being walking around on a planet, and the planet is in a universe, and it's you sort of feel like you've been put here from somewhere else, because that's the way that it's worded. But of course, you're an extension of the planet. You're sort of an outgrowth of it, you know, and you're constantly being recycled, and all the atoms are going back into the earth and then coming into you. And it's like if you were to fast forward, you know, I don't know, if you were to track every atom and fast forward that, you just see this cloud of matter, you know, and you're just sort of this ephemeral. But it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like you have this continuous process with everything, because the way that we word it all. So
I think you're right on.
Yeah. So maybe words have words have just like memory is very characteristic of our consciousness. Maybe our wording and categorization is as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think what you're hinting at, if I understood you correctly, is our sense of I-ness, our sense of subjectivity. What are we? And we humans have this sense that we are separate from the world where we live. You know, there is me and there is the rest of the world. There is you, there is my girlfriend, and there are the neighbors across the street. This arises from self-reflection as well. Because you see, suppose you're having a bellyache. Who are you? Are you the bellyache, or are you the one who knows that he's having a bellyache? It's the latter, right?
Yeah.
You are the one who tells yourself, I am having a bellyache. Otherwise, you would be the bellyache, because there would be nothing else for you to be. That bellyache is the experience of the moment. It's all there is. So you are it. But the moment you self-reflect, the moment you cognitively, metacognitively represent that pain, and then you pull yourself from the pain and you say, well, I am the one having the pain. That's a metacognitive state. It's a re-representation. That's what takes us out of the world. And guess what? We do this through a semiotic operation, through language, whether it's explicit or implicit. You can have implicit language as well. You can implicitly symbolize something. What is called access consciousness in the technical literature. Access consciousness is when a mental state serves the purpose of just pointing to another mental state. Whether you have a word associated with that or not, it doesn't matter, because the semiotic operation is implicitly happening. And that's what gives us our sense of separate identity. It's this capacity from metacognition. And people who have good memories of their childhood are able to tell when they extricated themselves from the world. Some people can do that. I know I did that at 9 years old. At 9 years old, it was an amazing experience. At 9 years old, I thought, I am me. I'm not the world around me. And it gave me a shiver down my backbone, you know, this cold shiver going down your backbone. For about 6 months, I had that at 9 years old. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, in his autobiography, Memory, Dreams, Reflections, he says that happened to him when he was 11. He said, before I realized that I am me, the moment you develop that self-reflective ability to extricate yourself from your experience as the subject of the experience, as opposed to the experience itself, happened to him like he was 11. And he said before that, it was like I were in the middle of a cloud, in a mist. There was no distinction between me and the world. And then suddenly you have that oh, I am me. And that's great, except that it's also the root of all human suffering. The shit begins at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. I was trying to think of, is there a time where that happened to me? And I think there was. So when I was a kid, I remember really not giving a shit, about anything really. So, a kid could say to me, "Oh, you're ugly, aren't you?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, I am." Yeah, and I'd laugh about it and like pull a funny face or whatever. Like, and you don't really, kids don't really give a shit. But then at a certain age, maybe a few years later, a different kid could say the same thing, and I was like, God, and then it hits you because you got this very, and like you just said, that's the root of the suffering. That like, oh, I'm a little me being attacked. That's the.
It starts innocently enough. It starts just with this re-representation of an experiential content that allows you to say, well, I'm not the experience, I'm the one which has or who has the experience. But then that's a sort of a seed for a crystal, and the crystal begins to grow around it. You start forming a narrative around that subject. It's not only the one who has the experience. Now I am the one who was born in that date, who has those parents and lived in that place and is ugly or is pretty, is intelligent or is stupid. And boom, when that narrative grows and grows and grows, and you identify with it. That narrative is just a content of consciousness, but you think it is you. You identify with that thing, and everything goes wrong from that point on.
Yeah. It's... all we really have is our consciousness and our contents and the contents of that consciousness. And I would call those perceptions. And I think you could pretty much label anything a perception. Like you're having a memory of something, well, it's a perception that you're having in your mind of something in the moment. I don't know whether you'd agree with that.
It's a convention. I don't use the word this way. I usually say perception is the experiences that are mediated by your sense organs. It's what you see, what you smell. But you also have endogenous experiences that are not perception. For instance, anxiety, love, fear. These are all endogenous.
Maybe we could use the word experience then. But what I was going to say is you, we get kind of lost in these pathways, don't we, of experiences. Like you were saying about these stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's like you actually get lost in that story, and you completely. No, you're this singular consciousness, and then you're just following this pattern of experiences. Whether it's internal thoughts about yourself or things that people tell you about yourself in the external world, or just the day-to-day experience of your life, and then the constant narrative building that you're doing along the way, and the whole time you're getting further and further away from actually what you are.
And I think the only way out is a forward escape. You know what a forward escape is, right? Like you're leading an army and you are pressed against a corner and the enemy is all around you. The only way to escape is just to punch through the enemy line. It's a forward escape. I think for us humans in the 21st century, the only way out is a forward escape. You only get out of it if you really turn on the volume on self-reflection, on this meta-consciousness. And you start really investigating this from ever higher levels of metacognition, saying, when you say, oh, I am the poor one that's suffering, and you go, actually, I am the one who knows or thinks that I am the one who is suffering.
Yeah.
Well, not even that. I am the one who thinks he knows that he is the one who is suffering. If you really pursue that path, at some point, and that's what Neo-Advaita non-duality teachers actually try to do, and they may not know that they're trying to do that, but this is what's happening. You bring so much self-reflection, so many layers of metacognition, you orient that so much to the inside, to your inner life, that you start questioning the basis for every single thought you have. And at some point, you get out of the hole. You punch through the lines of the enemy, I have been out of the hole a couple of times for a few minutes.
Right.
And you fall back in again.
Do you think, earlier we were saying why this singular consciousness that underlies everything would dissociate into all these different forms. Do you think it's possible that in the same way that we get lost in these stories about I am this and I am that and blah, 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 and just over self-identification, do you think that it's possible that the singular consciousness, the fundamental consciousness, is doing that, and that's why we are like we're just really far down the rabbit hole here as a human being. Like we've really moved far from what we actually are. I don't know.
Well, is it possible? Maybe. So from that perspective, it is possible. Do I think that it is the case? I don't think so. I think I'm more with Schopenhauer in this regard. I think mind at large is not really metacognitive. Mind at large is instinctive. It is experiential, but it's not deliberate. It's not planning what it's doing. It's not telling itself what it is doing. Oh, I'm going to start the universe with this fundamental constant, and I'll make sure that there is that planet on the periphery of a galaxy where life... I don't think it has happened like this, which of course exposes me to the problem of fine-tuning, which is... I absolutely hate that problem because I don't know how to solve it. Every answer that I could come up with, I immediately shoot down as nonsense or not parsimonious. But okay, if I ignore the problem of the fine-tuning, I prefer that it didn't exist, but unfortunately it does. So I just ignore it, I pretend that it doesn't exist. I think mind at large is instinctive. It's, it may be lost. Its behavior is predictable and regular in the sense that the laws of physics are regular and predictable. But that may have to do just with a different perception of time. What for us is a huge amount of time in which the universal laws have been consistent, from the point of view of mind at large, may be a moment. And it will change its mind instinctively the next moment, but you're not going to be around to see that, because that may be billions of years in the future. You know what I mean? We need a good theory of time to make sense of that. But I suspect mind at large is instinctual precisely also because it's so regular. Like a crocodile is highly predictable. You know exactly when it's going to snap, at what distance it's going to snap, you know how it's going to react to this and that. It's a very predictable, regular mind because it's fully instinctive. It doesn't have this deliberation. That's where things get chaotic, this deliberation. You know, wow, what should I do? You know, pros and cons, what about this, what about that? And then everything becomes unpredictable. I think in the whole of nature, insofar as we have reason to believe, we are the only self-reflective centers of consciousness around, which may be good and may be terrible, you know. In religious symbology, in Christian symbology, we have taken a bite from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and we realized that we are naked, you know. Realizing that you are naked, that's metacognition. Before we were naked, we experienced nakedness, but we didn't know that we were naked. There was no metacognition. We took a bite from that fruit, and here we are in hell, because that's the source of all suffering. I don't think mind at large is in hell. I don't think mind at large is ruminating about things, you know. I think it's just being what it is, in a different scale, subjective scale of time. And predictably, because the laws of nature are just the image of what it is, and it is always what it is. There's nothing else beyond it. That's what I suspect. I don't know whether it's good news or bad news, but it's aligned with Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer called universal consciousness the will, and there was a reason for that. That universal consciousness preceded the formation of individual centers of awareness, you know, dissociated alters. So there was no perception, there were only endogenous experiences. There was no outside world, because the will is all there is. There was no outside world from the perspective of the will. So it's endogenous, and it's dynamic. The universe is going somewhere, things are changing, so there has to be an impetus for change. That's why he calls that universal consciousness the will, because volitional states provide impetus and are purely endogenous. And he said the will is blind And what he meant by blind is it lacks self-reflectiveness, which he called knowledge. Schopenhauer called self-reflection knowledge. And the will in itself, before us, has no knowledge. In other words, it's blind. It acts instinctively. I think he had a point there, despite the problem of fine-tuning, which I don't know how to solve.
Okay. So, so the consciousness of the universe at large is more sort of pure experience, and then we are the sort of the self-reflection of that.
Yeah, I think
as if it's held up a mirror to itself, but
yes.
the mirror is our nervous system.
Yes,
the nervous systems. Yeah,
and there is clearly an evolutionary advantage for the development of self-reflection when mind sort of turns in upon itself. We dominate this planet now. Right? There are almost 8 billion of us, and all the other animals are subject to our will now. So evolutionarily, it's been cool. It has been extraordinarily useful. Mind at large doesn't need it because it's all there is. It's not competing within an ecosystem. It is that which surrounds all ecosystems. There was no reason for it to evolve this. There was a reason for us to evolve. Whether this means that we won the lottery or fell into hell, I think both. We definitely survived. We survived so well that we are coming to the point that we will end up killing ourselves. And does that have a net benefit from mind at large? Maybe when we die and our dissociative processes end, we sort of release these metacognitive experiences, this knowledge we acquired, we release that into the whole. It doesn't disappear, right? It's all in one mind. So when this dissociation happens, you release those contents, and that may be useful or not, I don't know. So far, the laws of nature don't seem to have changed since human beings have started dying and releasing whatever metacognitive cognition they've acquired and accumulated through life. Maybe it takes a lot longer, or maybe this is not at all how it works. I don't know.
What do you make of these near-death experiences? And it sort of leads on from what you were saying then.
I think it's one more instance in which impaired brain activity, reduced brain metabolism, leads to a decrease in dissociation. And therefore you apprehend things that you cannot normally know through the mediation of your sense organs. Just like self-strangulation, hyperventilation, psychedelics, meditation, the whole gamut of near-death experience as well. Because what happens when your heart stops? There is no more oxygenation in your brain. Brain metabolism stops in seconds, except for maybe some deep things in the limbic system which cannot account for the experiences that are reported. So I think it's just one more instance of this pattern that I think is established. So in other words, I think these are authentic experiences in the sense that what people report is really what they experienced. Even though these experiences are completely, completely is too much, largely inconsistent with one another in the details. In the themes, they are identical. In the details, they differ. And I think that happens because, you're not experiencing an objective realm anymore. What you bring to the experience shapes the experience as well. It sort of covers that objective layer into with a layer of symbolisms that arise based on what you bring to it. So for somebody from India, he sees Krishna. A Christian will see Jesus. An atheist will see the dead grandmother or a light. We sort of cover it with a symbolic layer that's dependent on what we bring to it. But the core is pretty consistent. People report pretty consistent things in terms of themes and the core of the experience. So I think these are authentic experiences. They are not being made up. They are not explainable by confabulation after the fact.
Yeah, I don't very much like the DMT experiences. I really don't think they are just hallucinations. Like if you read some of these reports of people. That people report from both of those different experiences. It's quite crazy. Like I went down a bit of a rabbit hole with near-death experiences, reading about those and listening to different accounts and stuff. And it's not what I expected. Like people are coming back. I'm not saying, you know, I kind of went in and sort of dreamed that I saw grandma. They're actually coming back and saying things like, no, that was more real than this. And I was a point of consciousness that could experience all directions at the same time and things like this. And it's like, well, I mean, they're not all like that. Sometimes people report having a body in this afterlife and meeting God and things like this. But some of them are quite similar sounding to these psychedelic experiences of oneness and all the rest of it. So
I think the experience you just mentioned, that is more real than this. This is a commonly recurring theme in psychedelic trances, near-death experiences. To me personally, I have had this experience, and there's no way out of that, because you can tell yourself, well, that sense of reality was a hallucination. But if you tell yourself that, then this sense of reality right now is also a hallucination, right? I have no reason to distinguish them. And that sense of that is more real than this. That stays with you. That said, I would invite you to contemplate the following. When you ask, oh, is that a hallucination or is that real? What do you mean? This is a hallucination. You know what I mean? It's real insofar as it is experienced. If it is experienced, it's real as such, as an experience. A hallucination is real as an experience. The question is this a shared, synchronized hallucination, like this world, ordinary world of ours, or is it a more idiosyncratic, non-synchronized hallucination? You know, as a youth said, you hallucinate reality anyway, whether you mediate that hallucination with DMT or psilocybin or normal neurotransmitters. It's a drug-induced or mediated hallucination anyway. This right now, your experience right now, is a serotonin-induced hallucination. So I think we have to depart from this naive idea of truth. This is called how is it called? It's one of the theories of truth. The correspondence theory of truth. That's how it's called. Which is this idea that there is an objective, defined, stable reality out there, and that statements are true or false, depending on whether they correspond or not with one of these defined objective states of the world out there. Well, guess what? Since quantum mechanics, we know that the world out there, as it really is, isn't really defined. You know, there is nothing defined there. You know, it's a superposition of possibilities that somehow gets translated into one synchronized reality. I suspect that the only thing we can really say with absolute confidence is that all there is mind. Everything that's happening is purely mental. I also think that the foremost, perhaps only, but the foremost disposition of mind, number 1, 2, and 3 in the list, is to deceive itself. That's what mind does. That's the fundamental characteristic of mentation. It is to tell itself stories, metacognitively or not, and deceive itself. So I think everything else is unreliable. The only thing I'm as confident as I think a human being can responsibly be confident about is that this is all mind. And mind is trying to constantly deceive itself, including deceive itself into believing that there is something other than mind.
Yeah.
That's what brings existence into being. This deception. If there were no deception, there wouldn't be anything. That's my intuition about what's happening. These are all nested layers upon layers upon layers of self-deception. If you peel down this onion all the way to the end, poof, there's nothing. This is the substance of reality, is mind deceiving itself. I never said that. You're the first one I share this insight with.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I'm just trying to process that. It's like, different, the layers and layers thing. That's quite interesting, because almost like it's a self-deception machine, isn't it? It's like machinery of self-deception.
Yeah, the layering mechanism is very important. The trick. Okay, now I'm going to get into an area that I can't really articulate logically why I'm going to say this. I do talk about this in one of my books, More Than Allegory, in part 3. I do talk about this. But it's the kind of thing that starts escaping language and escaping common references that are needed in order to communicate something. But I'll try, and I hope people don't judge me for it. The layering mechanism is key, because the key trick of self-deception is when you think you figured out what the deception is. When you think you figured it out, you fall onto the layer underneath, and you say, oh, that's the real reality. What I thought then was a self-deception. Now I saw through the trick, so now I'm back to reality. And guess what? That is the deception. That reality you think you fell back to because you saw the deception, that is the deception. Everything else was a way to take your eye off the ball, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then when you think you saw that, like I just described, I saw that. Now guess what? I am in the third layer of self-deception, thinking, oh, I figured out this distraction mechanism. Now I know what's true. And guess what? There will be another one. The layering mechanism is very critical because it uses skepticism as a tool of self-deception. And that's very important, to turn skepticism around and use it as a tool of self-deception. And I think if you really peel that onion, then there is just the great void of Buddhism, if you know what I mean. There is nothing left. I think that's my intuition.
You know what? I was going to ask something about similar to this. Let me try and think how to word this. So what you were just saying there, is it possible that in this level that we've got to now, where we drop down and say, everything's consciousness, I get it, could that actually be another layer of deception? Like this thought occurred to me when I was listening to it was Jordan Peterson, and he had some event talking about transcendence. They were talking about what is transcendence, or the transcendent. That was it. What is the transcendent? And he made this point that I thought was really interesting. He was saying the transcendent is in the gaps in our knowledge, and he gave this example of if you were talking with someone and you thought you knew the person, and then they said something that revealed something about their personality that you didn't know before. That would be a gap into the transcendent there. It would be that little thing that they reveal to you. They'll be revealing the thing that transcended your understanding before, which is their actual personality. And then, so you could apply that to the whole of reality. At first we thought the Earth was flat, and then we realized, no, it's not. And so the thing that transcended our understanding of the world was the fact that the Earth was round. And we were ignorant to that before, but then it became part of our knowledge, and so it wasn't transcendent anymore, and so on and so on and so on, until maybe we get to this point where we're like, I see, everything's consciousness, and maybe there's actually something beyond consciousness that transcends consciousness altogether, that we're ignorant to. Maybe, I don't know.
I think this only works if you define consciousness in a specific restrictive way, like access consciousness or meta consciousness. If you define consciousness as phenomenal consciousness, in other words, just raw experience, I think this doesn't work, and I'll tell you why. How did we get here? We got here by hypothesizing that the fundamental disposition of mind is to deceive itself. In that context, all knowledge becomes unreliable except one. There is mind. Because there has to be that thing that deceives. If everything's a deception, that deception has to happen within mind, because there has to be the deceiver and the deceived. Otherwise, there is no deception. Know what I mean? So if we go for maximum epistemic uncertainty, if we say, I know nothing, then all you know is there is mind. Knowing nothing means you know there is mind. Because you know nothing. You know.
You are the mind that knows.
Yeah, you are the mind that came up with this thought. And we cannot say that nothing exists, because otherwise we wouldn't be saying it. There is that which says that. So there is something. What is the most skeptical position to take? That something is mind, and the fundamental directive of that mind is to deceive itself. So this works to undermine anything you think you know, except one thing: there is mind. You cannot use that against this fundamental statement. It doesn't shoot itself in the foot, if you know what I mean. That's the foundation of epistemology. Of everything, there is mind. That you know. I would add one thing. I'm not a solipsist. I think there is mind behind the image I see on my screen right now. There is something it is like to be you. That is also mind. It's a mind I cannot directly access, but it's also mind. It's the same ontological category, so to say. So that's not the most skeptical position. Solipsism would be the most skeptical position. In other words, all there is my personal mind. But if I thought that, I would just roll up in a corner and wait to die, right? There is no point in even talking about anything. But I don't think the idea that mind is up to deceiving itself all the time, I don't think that implies that even mind's an illusion. No, there has to be that within which the illusion happens.
Yeah. It's just very hard to get to, because there's so many layers of deception, isn't there?
It's because when we say mind, a whole baggage, a whole conceptual baggage goes with it. It's our internal, non-verbal idea of what mind is. And all of them are wrong, because mind is that which has all those ideas about what mind is. Mind is itself not an idea. So you cannot tell yourself what mind is. Mind is that which is telling yourself all kinds of nonsense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't capture it in a concept. And because we then not project, we mistake mind for a story in mind, then we start questioning, is this true what I just said? Now maybe it's not true. Now guess what? If you think it's not true, it's because what you're interpreting implicitly mind to mean is not what I mean. What I mean by mind is the bottom layer of reality. It's the bottom of the epistemic stack. It's the one thing you cannot doubt. Because the mere fact that you are doubting it means that it exists. Otherwise there would be no doubting. It's the bottom layer of it all. And my epistemic position is, I know that because I'm doubting, but everything else is potentially deception. And look, I'm playing the game of deception here, you know. I'm talking about an ism, idealism. I'm fighting a cultural battle for the hearts and minds of people. And I'm fully aware that this whole thing is a game. That's my inner life. I know it's all game. I don't take things seriously in the sense that Alan Watts used to say. I don't mean by that I'm casual about things. But I'm also aware that, that's my truth, that this is ultimately a game. I just think that the game can be played better. I think we can get closer to truth. The ultimate truth is a void. It's when you peel the onion, there's nothing at the end. But we can get closer to that by peeling a particularly bad, stupid, untenable layer, which is mainstream materialism, mainstream physicalism. It's just a very bad story. It's an untenable story to anybody who really thinks about it for 15 minutes with some care and open mind, and is able to become aware of one's own prejudices. Otherwise, the prejudices play on you. And I think we can move as a culture beyond that, one step closer to truth. And that, I think, is already very valuable, even though the result is we are still playing a game, but we are playing better.
Yeah. I think there is a move in culture towards this idea that we're all one consciousness. Yeah,
Oh.
I hear it in some strange places. Like, what was it? Sam Harris's podcast recently. He had his wife on there, and they started talking about panpsychism, and it's the first time I've ever heard it him sort of talk about it seriously. That was interesting.
He has dropped hints before.
Yeah, he has. Yeah.
I don't think what I'm saying is panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that all matter is conscious.
Yeah, yeah.
So consciousness is in matter, but in all matter, not only in the matter of the brain. What I'm saying is that matter is in consciousness. I'm saying precisely the opposite. I'm not saying that consciousness is a property of all matter or in some way bound by the structures of matter, atomic structures, particles, whatever. I'm saying that all of that exists in consciousness as an image of consciousness, presented to consciousness itself. So I'm an idealist, or you could call me an idealist cosmopsychist, which is the new fashionable academic name. You know, we try to renew things by giving old ideas new names. Idealism has existed for, I don't know, over 3,000 years in the Indus Valley in India. People were already talking about it. There's nothing new in what we are saying. We're just reminding ourselves of what our ancestors once knew. But fine, if I am to play that game, okay, cosmopsychism. But it's not panpsychism. So, and Sam Harris has dropped hints that he is inclined towards panpsychism before. There is a video of him in which he says, well, half the universe is not material, it's qualitative, it's consciousness. Well, when you talk about half, then you're saying there are real material properties and there are real conscious properties that are not reducible to the material properties. So you are a dual aspect monist, a Russellian panpsychist, as they say today. So he sort of showed his cards before, maybe not explicitly, but if you pay attention, you see that that he has that position. It's not my position. I don't think the material properties are irreducible. I think material properties exist only insofar as they are experienced. So they are reducible to qualities, to consciousness.
Yeah. It's sort of still getting lost in the idea that the things that you're seeing out there are really things out there, and so whatever consciousness is, it must be in those things that are out there. Well, but actually, there's no.
I think there is something out there, but it's mental processes as well that are not within the boundaries of my dissociated outer. They are outside the boundaries, but they are out there. But I think the physical world we perceive, the contents of perception, which we reduce to atoms, which is just our way of identifying what the pixels are of the screen of perception. That's what basic subatomic particles are. If you look at the standard model of particle physics, you have 4 classes of irreducible subatomic particles. Well, maybe they are patterns of vibration of different quantum fields. Yeah, forget about that. Let's not go into quantum field theory. We stay with vanilla standard model. You have those primary subatomic particles. What are they in my interpretation? In my interpretation, that's our way of describing the pixels of the screen of perception. It's pixelated. It's not continuous. And if I see you on this screen on my computer and I look very closely, you are pixelated. I see the pixels. Does that mean that you are pixelated according to this screen? No, it's just the way your image is projected onto this screen that turns it into a pixelated structure. It's a property of the screen, not of you. I would say perception in general, when I look at another human being in front of me, when I say I can reduce this human being to 4 types of fundamental subatomic particles, to me, that's equivalent to saying this is a property of the screen of perception. These subatomic particles are the pixels of the screen of perception. You are not made of subatomic particles. You are made of inner experiences, your experiential inner life. That's what you are. But that inner life presents itself to me on my screen of perception in such a way that it's pixelated. It's just an artifact of the representation, not of the thing in itself. So from that perspective, when panpsychists say subatomic particles are conscious, I'd say no, because I don't even grant that subatomic particles really exist in and of themselves. I think they are just an artifact of the pixelation of the screen of perception. It's just how things present themselves to me, not how things are in themselves. I don't think a subject of experience, dissociated or not, is pixelated, is made of subatomic particles. Do you understand what I mean? So I don't think that my inner life is built up of little consciousnesses in the little atoms and electrons in my brain coming together and forming the subject I know to be myself, Bernardo. I don't think that's how it happens. I don't think I'm made of atoms at all. I think that's an artifact of how my inner life presents itself to you. So from that perspective, I'm not a panpsychist at all. I don't say that matter has consciousness, fundamentally. I say that matter is in consciousness as a way, as a quality of experience. That's all.
Yeah, so I see what you mean. So like, in the same way, like if you closed your eyes and you could feel your body, you know, you could feel where it is, you can feel the warmth of the, or, you know, you could feel the pressure of the seat underneath you and stuff like that. You know that those feelings are in your consciousness and nowhere else. No, they're not really in the atoms. Yeah. The feelings are not really in the atoms. And in the same way, when you open your eyes and see the world, as a feeling of vision that you're having, and that feeling of vision isn't really out there in the world. And so when you look at the world very closely and you see that there's atoms and subatomic particles, that's still a feeling of vision in your consciousness, and it's not really representative of what the world actually is.
And guess what? What I'm about to say is recognized in physics. It's not even polemical, but it's most people who are not involved don't stop to think about it and don't know that this is true. Most people think that when we talk about, you know, the menu of fundamental subatomic particles in the standard model, people think those are real concrete things that you can see and hold and that's not it. Subatomic particles are convenient fictions. That's what an anti-realist would say, and there is no good argument against it. They are fictions that help us explain the behavior of our measurement instruments. You don't see fundamental subatomic particles like quarks and gluons and muons. You don't see them. What you see is ticks, bips, and lines in measurement equipment. Now, the subatomic particles are a theoretical tool that helps us build a model to explain the behavior of our measurement equipment. I mean, I used to work at CERN in the mid-90s when we were designing the Atlas experiment, which found the Higgs boson a few years ago. We were busy with the designing of that. And I can tell you what a subatomic particle is. It's a histogram on a computer screen in the control room, where I used to do late night shifts. Because I was a young guy, I didn't need to sleep, so I would do the shift from midnight to 4 a.m. very regularly. Everybody wanted to exchange with me. They didn't want to do the late night shift, and I gladly took it from everybody. That's what a subatomic particle is. It's a histogram on a computer screen. If you want to look behind that histogram, then there are clicks and electrical impulses coming out of a calorimeter. You know, it's a tile calorimeter with some fiber optics connected to it. When they scintillate, you say, oh, a subatomic particle has crossed that tile. That's a theoretical abstraction, you see. You didn't see that subatomic particle crossing a tile in the tile calorimeter. What you saw was a little scintillation in the fiber optics that gets processed, fed into a computer, and displayed to you as a histogram, a graph. That's what it is. Everything else is just very, very well designed, very precise, very internally consistent, convenient fictions to explain the behavior of measurement instruments. Yeah, it's true what I just told you. It's not a polemical philosophical position. It's just the way it is.
It's just like this stuff is just, we're so conditioned to see the world in a particular way that, you know, I can follow you like fairly well, and then at a certain time my old way of thinking just comes back, and it's like it has to start thinking about things that are really like out there objectively and stuff. And, you know, you say particle, and then I think something outside my mind, and it's pretty hard to like stay within the new framework.
Look, the cultural narrative is like a black hole, and we are all within the gravity well of that black hole. It's very, you can escape a little bit, but you're dragged back in very quickly. And I mean, I'm saying these things to you, but I know fairly well that tomorrow morning when I wake up, get into my car and go to work, my reality will be replaced by the mainstream narrative. Human beings are hardly in contact with reality as it really is. We replace it with a narrative. We don't experience things as they are. We experience things as we tell ourselves they are. We live our inner storytelling. Even our perceptions, the way we partition the world into objects and events, it's arbitrary. I mean, the world is a continuum of varying qualities. And we partition things in a screen, a mouse, a keyboard for convenience reasons. Take a car. You would say, well, it's not arbitrarily defined, right? A car is a car. And then I'll ask you, how do you define then the unity of a car and distinguish it from the rest of the world? And then you might say, well, a car is that thing you need to drive around. So you define it in functional terms, right? A car is separate from something else because the car moves around and something else doesn't. Well, if you go down this functional path, defining the car as in functional terms, I would tell you, you certainly need the spark plugs, right? Because without the spark plugs, the car doesn't work. And you'd say, exactly, so the spark plugs are part of the car. And you'd say, well, you need the tires as well, right? Because without the tires, the car doesn't function. And you'd say, yes, exactly, the tires. And then I would start saying, you also need the fuel. You need the road, because if there is no road, the tires don't grip anything and then it doesn't move. You need gravity too, because if there isn't gravity pushing the tires against the road, nothing moves. By the way, you need air, because without air, you don't cool. There's no combustion without air, and moreover, you don't cool the engine. But forget cooling. There's no combustion, so the car also doesn't move without air. And if you follow this path, there's only the universe, and everything else is
the car begins to engulf the whole universe.
It disappears.
There's no difference.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And then if you go down really the rabbit hole of quantum entanglement, there are very good reasons to think that the universe is a quantum entangled system. And if it is that, then parts cannot be described independently of each other. There can only be a global description. There is only the universe as a whole. There is no separate thing. So even when we partition the world into separate things and events, which is the life we live in, that's already the imposition of a narrative onto the world. There are no separate things in events in the world out there. There isn't. That partition is nominal, as people say in philosophy. It's nominal. It means that it's arbitrary and done by convenience. Because, I needed to be able to use the word car in order to go to a place and buy one for myself and get to work. So for convenient reasons, we establish these arbitrary boundaries in nature. But we go beyond. We lose contact with the fact that these are just narratives that we tell ourselves for convenience. We think they are real. And that's the reality we live, is the reality of our own inner storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah, we think ourselves are real as well. I'm this person, and I am whatever my job role is. And
your real self certainly has to be real. Otherwise, there wouldn't be nothing here to be deceived.
It wouldn't function. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's what I think. You mentioned that you know Donald Hoffman. I talked to him recently, and his theory is pretty interesting. But it sort of touches upon this because, obviously we need these categories and these things to actually survive. Otherwise, we wouldn't have evolved at all. It would be impossible to evolve if we thought we were the whole universe all the time. Yeah. So
I can comment on that if you like.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think Don is right on. I think he's hitting the nail in the head. The way the world presents itself to us on the screen of perception is the result of an evolutionary process that optimized for survival, not for truth. We didn't evolve to see things as they really are. We evolved to see things in a way that would maximize our chances of surviving and reproducing. If that is so, then what you see presented on the screen of perception that's the analogy he uses, is like your computer desktop. You see all these little rectangles representing files, and you drag a file to a trash bin. That's not the reality of things. The reality of things are open and closed electronic switches and a computer chip. But that doesn't help you do your tasks. So if you had to operate by seeing those electronic switches opening and closing, you'd become too confused. You wouldn't be able to do anything. So you put a layer of fiction in between. Because if you operate within that layer of fiction, the metaphors, visual metaphors of a computer desktop, you're much more effective. In other words, you survive better, you stand a better chance to reproduce. So what Dawn is saying is that the universe we think is real around us is just a computer desktop. What's really going on, we don't have access to because we are limited to the desktop. We cannot look behind it. We didn't evolve a cognitive apparatus to look behind it. We evolved a cognitive apparatus to create a functional fantasy. I think you can go even much further down that rabbit hole, but I think if our culture as a whole already accepts this first step, it's a huge step forward. So I'm very fond of Don Hoffman.
Yeah, me too. His ideas are just amazing because it's not. So the thing that gets me about his ideas is he doesn't say that like just everything that we experience is like on a desktop, but that space and time itself is the desktop, so that whatever the world is, it's not in space and time. But that is pretty interesting to me because that means whatever we are as well is.
Yes, but we cannot attribute this to him, even in the history of Western philosophy. Let's forget the East, because if we bring in the East, we are very poor people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But even in Western philosophy, this came up already with Kant. In the 18th century, Kant said space and time are, trying to remember the precise words, but it is basically, it's a cognitive process. It's an endogenous thing. The space-time is a cognitive screen onto which we project the contents of our experience in order to be able to separate things. Yeah. Space-time is not inherent in the world as it is in itself. Space-time is a tool of perception. We create space-time as the screen of perception. But in the world as it is in itself, we cannot speak of space-time. Space and time are qualities of experience. So that came with Kant, that was emphasized with Schopenhauer already in the 19th century, 1818, I think, Schopenhauer already published that. It became popular in the middle 19th century. And then towards the end of the 19th century, we forgot that. And physics again took up this idea of space and time as something so real with Einstein that it could even be bent. Now, that's a very substantial thing, and it didn't occur to people that what is being bent is your perception. It's the fluidity of your perception. But anyway, that's another story. So we cannot attribute this particular idea to Dawn, which doesn't minimize the importance of the idea, by the way.
No, well, it is an amazing idea, isn't it? Because it's like, well, you can't really imagine what it's like to have no time. But what that idea is saying is that whatever we are is not actually in space and time. Space and time is, or what we are is consciousness. And so space and time are in consciousness. And so what we are is not in space and time, it's the other way around.
At least not necessarily. I think the key argument, it's not necessarily so. But since we are being agnostic about what the thing in itself actually is, we can't also eliminate that possibility completely. Because if this is a hallucination, and I use this word with reservation, a hallucination in the sense that it doesn't correspond to the thing in itself, it's only a feature or a property of the representation of our cognitive apparatus, you cannot exclude the possibility that by pure chance, the representation happens to actually coincide with how the thing in itself actually is. So there is a non-zero possibility that that is actually the way things are, that there is actually space and time out there. The claim is an epistemic one. We have every reason to think that space and time are not out there. That's the claim. It's not a categorical exclusion of that possibility. We can't do that.
Yeah, okay. Right, it's getting rather late here.
Yeah, we talked a long time.
2:30 in the morning, yeah. I do have one more thing that I wanted to ask you, right? If you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. It's
okay.
still 8:25 in the evening here for me. So.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, my brain's still working. I'm not that tired yet. Right, so it was really an add-on to that earlier discussion we had about DMT and psychedelics and things. Do you find it intriguing that, like I said about the study with the DMT and the alpha brainwaves dropping and all the rest of it, and the idea of the brain as a reducing valve, and that if you were to widen the valve, you would let in more experience of what the universe actually is. And so when people take DMT, they transcend their bodies and go into this place, and they meet these entities. And when people write about this, if you read these reports online, people use words like it felt like another dimension. Again, they say it's more real than real. They say things about time as well, like it's like people say that they could have been there for 10 minutes or 100 years. There was no way to tell.
I had a trip once that I thought this is 100,000 years at least. When I came back and I looked at my wife, then I thought, my God, I haven't seen you in eons. Sorry to interrupt you. Continue.
Oh, well, okay, all right. Well, right. So, do you think it's intriguing that people talk about sort of going to another dimension and things like this, their consciousness being revealing another dimension to their consciousness? And then we do have physical theories. We do have theories in physics that postulate other dimensions. And I was reading, I'm far too tired to go into the details. I don't really understand it very well. But I was reading a few articles about David Bohm and his idea of the implicate and explicit order, and how the implicate order extends into like infinite dimensionality. And is it possible that, I don't know, it's like, it seems pretty intriguing, doesn't it? That in this idealist view, all there is consciousness. And so when I look at the world around me, I'm looking at the contents of my consciousness. And if I use mathematics to describe it, if I was smart enough and I was a string theorist or something, or if I use the certain mathematics to describe what I'm visually observing, or I could get back equations that suggest that whatever is around me has within it enfolded dimensions that are beyond my perception. It seems pretty weird how, yeah.
I think I know. Yeah, I know where you're going with this. It requires a slightly elaborate commentary. I have to be careful. Okay, physical theories, in principle, are also convenient fictions. They are models of what's going on. They aren't exactly what is going on. They are convenient fictions that work in practice with a high degree of reliability, so they're very useful to predict how nature will behave and develop technology and all that. But they don't go to the point where they say, well, this is actually how nature is. Physicists who take this next step are philosophically naive. They haven't thought through the issues very well. So when physicists say, well, there may be 11 dimensions, 7 curled up dimensions that we don't see because they're curled up according to exquisitely complex topologies, these are models. Things behave perhaps as if these were true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's literally so. That's first comment. Second comment is, what motivates physicists to postulate hidden dimensions is a very specific set of measured phenomena that are unrelated to the experience of a psychedelic trip. So I don't think these two things are necessarily the same. I don't think the hyperdimensionality which is a term we use to describe certain psychedelic experiences, are necessarily the same thing that physicists mean when they talk about extra dimensions, because these two things came from widely different motivations. One was to build a model to accommodate certain measurements, and the other one was to describe a felt experience. So I don't think they are necessarily the same thing, although they could be. I cannot eliminate that possibility either. Third observation I would make is I would be very cautious about psychedelic gnosis. This idea that what you experience in a psychedelic trip is true as you experienced it. And I go back to what I said earlier. I think the main disposition of mind is to deceive itself, and that happens also in a psychedelic trip. I think a psychedelic experience is a very noisy channel, so to say. I think it has more negative value than positive value. It's more useful to tell you which narratives you tell yourself are actually bullshit than to replace that narrative with another one that's truer. You understand what I mean? So it's negative value. The value is in telling you what you are deceiving yourself with in your regular, ordinary life. Now, what is compelling about a psychedelic trip is that sense of hyper-reality. But a sense of hyper-reality doesn't necessarily mean that what you experience is objectively true, independent of you. Because no reality may be like that. Reality may be the product of an interaction between what you bring to it and what whatever is out there brings to it in turn. And it so happens that our realities are more or less synchronized at the level of what can be described in words. But for all you know, if I could take my consciousness and enter you, and you could take your consciousness and enter me, you might be shocked and think, oh my God, his reality is totally different than my reality. What I consider green, he sees as blue. But he calls blue green, so I think he's seeing the same thing as I am, because there is this synchronization at the level of words. Words are very blunt, crude instruments. There is no nuance, no subtlety, no detail, nothing. So our reality is the same insofar as descriptions go, but we may be living widely different experiential realities, because I think that's the nature of what there is. The nature of what there is whatever you experience is part what you bring to it, part what comes from the outside. And I think that's the same in an NDE than in a psychedelic trance. The psychedelic gnosis is not a realization of an objective truth separate from you. It's a realization of the reality that emerges when you interact with something else. And both these sides bring something to it. And it's a very noisy channel. There is a lot of nonsense in a psychedelic trance as well. I'm sure you have experienced that. There's nonsense when you're taking off, and there's nonsense in the re-entry. And somewhere in between, sometimes there is this experience of, oh, this is more real than real, which you can't bring back. And you know, in the trance, you know, there's no way I will remember this. There is no way this will fit into my head once serotonin reasserts itself. It just will not fit. And you know that on the spot. You know, I'm going to forget this. I'm not going to take this back with me. It doesn't pass through the hole. It's too big. That is the interesting part. But even that, I think, is part what you bring to it and part what is out there. And what you bring to it may be something as trivial. It's incredibly important. It's maybe the most important thing, but people would look upon it as trivial. It could be the questions you bring. Something as simple as the questions you bring will modulate what you see, because that's nature's answer. And you don't need a psychedelic trip to see things like this. In quantum physics, if you measure the spin of an electron, if you measure the spin in this direction, it will be either up or down. Always. It will be either up or down. If you measure the spin in this direction, it will always be either left or right. Always. So nature replies to the question you asked. There is no objective state. The spin is either up, down, left, or right, or in an angle. It's not how things work. It's an interaction between what you bring to it in the form of the questions you're implicitly asking, what you implicitly want to understand, what you want to know, how you frame the question, and what is out there. From that perspective, I think it's more real than real, because it transcends dissociation, but it's not objective in the sense that it's independent of what you bring to it. That's my view.
Okay.
So I drifted far away from your original question.
No,
Sorry.
no, you didn't. I'm trying to. So, right. So I asked the question. So you were saying about there's one thing physicists are trying to explain this particular thing, and then there's the hyperdimensionality that people talk about with psychedelic experiences. I asked the question that tried to tie the two together because, like in our view of the world, we have this separation between the consciousness here and the world out there, and so when the scientists are talking about the physics of the world, we think of it as just this stuff out here. Oh, there's higher dimensions to matter. Yeah. But of course, we are that as well. So whatever there's higher dimensions to, there's higher dimensions to us if there is higher dimensions. And so, but I know exactly what you were getting at there, about the questions that you bring, and I wonder, how much of our own reality in everyday life is an answer to the questions that we're bringing. And
the way I interpreted your question was, could it be that what we experience in a DMT trance, I never took DMT, by the way, okay. I've taken psilocybin and salvia, what we experience as a hyperdimensional reality in a DMT trip, could it be this objective reality that physicists are talking about? And my answer to you was, neither is an objective reality. What physicists are modeling is the behavior of the desktop, to use Don Hoffman's analogy. The world isn't what we perceive. And what is physics? Physics is the study of the dynamics and regularities of perception. That's what physics is. Physics is modeling the behavior of the desktop. It doesn't even touch what's behind the desktop in Don Hoffman's reality. Now, this desktop behavior seems to be similar across observers insofar as language allows us to convey what we experience and find this commonality. But language is also very blunt. So what I'm trying to get across to you is that this idea of objectivity may not be, it's an assumption. It's when you realize that something's false and you fall back to another level of skepticism, this is what's happening now. You're falling back to that level of objectivity, right? And I think that's the deception already. You're falling into, this is it's a diversionary tactics of mind in the process of deceiving itself, you know what I mean? I don't think there is this objective reality to begin with. I think it's an operationally valid assumption, is an operationally functional assumption. As far as language is concerned, we can coordinate our actions as though we lived in the same world. And things work properly. Language allows us to coordinate things this way, and physics models this seeming regularity. But when you're talking about going deeper down the rabbit hole, this convenient these things that seem to work in practice are not fundamental aspects of reality. So I think we have to abandon them. I think experiences of a DMT trip are real as such, as experiences. And I think that's all there is to it, even right now. And that we think it's all a shared experience is itself a content of experience. It's a story you experience in your own mind. Know what I mean?
Yeah. So kind of clicked when you said that.
Yeah. So I think psychedelic gnosis is a tricky thing insofar as we try to bring our assumptions about objectivity and we try to carry them over to the psychedelic realm. That's where it goes wrong. I think you have to look underneath those assumptions. You have to question them as well. And that's why I said I think the gnosis is valid as far as it's a negative gnosis. It tells you what the bullshit that you think is real and it's not. And I think it is real as an experience, but when you bring objectivity into it, that's where I think we got sort of tied up in our own narrative making.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, I think, on that. Yeah. Yeah. It's mind-bending stuff, isn't it, really? To try and wrap your head around.
But we don't need to go that far to change our culture positively. I mean, we are going really down the rabbit hole today. I don't think I've ever gone this deep before in an interview. At a cultural level, it would already be an enormous step forward if we truly acknowledged that a better story about what's going on is that there is something objective, but it is mental. And it's mentality interfering with mentality that generates the qualities that we call perception: form, color, taste, flavor, aroma, and everything else. Instead of trying to bridge this gap from an abstract, no mental world to a mental world. It's an impossible and impassable gap. It would be already a tremendous step forward, in other words, if idealism were the mainstream narrative. And then we could busy ourselves with the really interesting stuff, the real, subtle, nuanced, difficult questions. Because right now we are wasting time with bullshit. We are not looking at what really is important because we're distracted by bullshit. We have to get the bullshit out of the way, and then we will have a much more productive, sophisticated dialogue about what's going on. That's my view.
Yeah, I think it would positively impact the world in terms of how we treat each other. I think as well,
at least
because essentially we're all the same self.
Yeah, that you can derive a moral system from it. I acknowledge that, but I think the most important part is it opens space for the really interesting questions. I think that's we could be having a cultural dialogue about the really interesting questions, instead of wasting time with something that is completely untenable and demonstrably so.
Yeah. You mean questions just as what?
Instead of having this discussion, is materialism or panpsychism or idealism correct? It's such a waste of time. We know enough to be able to answer this and move on. We know enough about what certainly doesn't work and stick to a hypothesis that may not be true, but at least we don't have a reason to discard it yet. It may work, get closer to the truth. And then we can have a dialogue about, okay, it's all in mind. What is mind actually doing? What are these dimensions? Because, dimensions is a model for an aspect of experience that is real as such, as an experience. We could be asking ourselves that. Is mind at large metacognizant or not? Is this a plan or is this all instinctive? Is there a purpose to what we are doing here? Is our metacognition the meaning of our existence? Or is this just chance? Evolution brought us here because we survived better than the others who were not metacognizant. These are the real questions. Is there intrinsic meaning to life? If the world out there is mental, there are huge implications, like then what I see on the screen of perception are symbols. They are not reality as it is in itself. They are pointing to something else. In the same way that patterns of my brain activity may indicate fear, may indicate love, may indicate chocolate cake in my mouth. In this exact same way, the physical world outside, like a map of brain activity, could be telling you indirectly something about the inner life of mind at large. What are the patterns of inanimate matter that indicate something about what mind at large is feeling from inside? These are the big questions. The moment idealism is adopted as the most likely scenario, the world is not just so. The world is a book. It's a narrative in a good sense. It's a collection of symbols that are pointing to something regarding the inner life of mind at large. And we should maybe understand it. We should maybe figure out what the meaning in a semantic sense is of the universe, of galaxy clusters, of stars, of waterfalls and thunderstorms. And know what I mean? These may be symbols of something else. What is a star pumping out light like that? Is that a symbol for love? What is a thunderstorm? Is that a symbol for anger? Maybe not. Maybe these are all anthropomorphic interpretations. Yeah. But if that is so, then what is it? What is it pointing to?
Symbols for things that we couldn't possibly understand. Maybe.
Exactly. Every pattern of brain activity corresponds to something in your inner life, to some experience. Therefore, every configuration of the inanimate world is indicating something about the inner life of mind at large, from where we came and to which we are going to return. Once we die and the dissociation ends. These are the discussions I would like to have. These are the meaningful, important questions. Not whether materialism or idealism, come on, you know. And sometimes I feel bored that I'm finding myself fighting this battle, because in my inner life, I'm not there anymore. In my inner life, I'm way somewhere else. I don't want to say way beyond because it's arrogant. I'm way somewhere else. But in my outer life, I still have to, publish academic papers defending what to me is obvious, and there's only a small group of people that I don't need to do it with. Like Rupert Spira, when I'm having dinner with Rupert Spira, that's the kind of conversation I want to have. And then I go out of that and I'm thinking, there we go again, academic articles, books, debates, defending things that from me are like, man, let's get on with it. This is not the kind of discussion I want to have, but it's the discussion I need to have, unfortunately.
I was watching a Rupert Spira video the other day, and they were talking about consciousness, obviously, and he mentioned you, and I was like, that's funny. He's like, my friend Bernardo. Wow, okay. It seems like everyone in this section of society that's interested in consciousness knows each other.
It's not a big community, we come together a couple of times a year. Sometimes with Rupert we schedule it, but other times it's just an event that everybody goes to, and it happens. It's not a... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I forgot what I wanted to say. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say his approach of explaining things is very helpful in terms of trying to understand this concept. I think he's very good at doing that.
Yeah, and he's a no-nonsense guy. He doesn't beautify it, he doesn't bring flowers to it, he doesn't romanticize it. It's just what is, and he knows it is because of direct experience without prejudice. The rest of us are telling ourselves stories, and we live the story. Yeah. He doesn't live the story.
I think, Bernardo, I'm going to have to leave it there. It is 10 to 3 in the morning here. So,
and tomorrow is Wednesday. You have to go to work.
It is. Well, luckily, I have a day off on Wednesday. So
okay.
Yeah, have a bit of a lie-in. But I think the dogs are probably sick of me talking loudly in here. So they want to sleep too. All right.
All right. It was a big pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Yeah, me too. Me too. Is there a place anyone can follow you if they're interested in following your work, or any books coming out or anything like that? Or
I have a book that just came out earlier this year, The Idea of the World. It's the most technical book I wrote so far, because I wanted to eliminate that criticism that, you're not rigorous enough, or not conceptually clear. So I wrote a book basically full academic level, beginning to end, with some chapters in between that sort of try to digest that for the general reader. So general readers can read that book. It's a sort of a legal case for idealism, if you know what I mean. No stone is left unturned. I address every criticism, very explicit in my argumentation. Everything is substantiated. That has just come out. There is another book coming out next year about Schopenhauer's metaphysics, where I say that Schopenhauer was an idealist through and through, objectively and subjectively he was an idealist. And I'm working now on a book about Jung's metaphysics. But these is all future stuff. People interested in my output can go to my website. There's a link to everything there. It's Bernardo Kastrup, one word, Kastrup with a K, .com. And then there are links to my videos, to my Scientific American essays, to my academic papers, my blog with very accessible stuff, my books. It's all there on the menu bar on the top.
Okay, great. All right, thank you very much for talking with me.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Cool. All right, and see you.